Good afternoon. I'm Stephanie Moore, Project Manager for Association of Community Cancer Centers. I'm eager to introduce our panel members today as the expert presenters for the 12th eCourse of the series hosted by the Institute for Clinical Immunology, ICLIO. As you may know, ICLIO is an institute of ACCC. It's the only initiative to prepare multidisciplinary cancer care providers for the complex implementation of immunology in a community setting. The ICLIO program provides a host of educational resources and tools such as webinars, newsletters, e-learning module eCourses, tumor subcommittee updates, an immersed IO visiting expert program, and live meetings. Now for today's eCourse, I am pleased to introduce Bill McGivney, McGivney Global Advisors, our moderator, Ivo Abraham, at the University of Arizona Cancer Center, Jennifer Hinkel, McGivney Global Advisors, and Ali McBride at the University of Arizona Cancer Center. Our panel of experts will be discussing the potential implications of ICER Value Assessment Framework will have on cancer programs and policy, healthcare costs, and patients. Now for a few housekeeping notes. Please feel free to submit questions to our presenter by typing questions in the box on your dashboard at any time during the webinar. I will pose these questions to the panel at the conclusion of the presentation. The webinar will be archived and available on our ICLIO website, accc-iclio.org. Now I'll send it over to Bill McGivney to set the stage for today's exciting webinar.
So good afternoon for those of you, I guess, in the Eastern and Central time zones, and good morning to those further west. And welcome to this webinar. We're going to be talking today about oncology value metric frameworks, and as Stephanie indicated, we will discuss these with an emphasis on the ICER framework specifically. And as she also mentioned, and they will speak in this order, we are happy to have 3 experts participating. And as already indicated, they are Dr. Ivo Abraham, Dr. Ali McBride, and Jennifer Hinkel. I, Bill McGivney, am the former CEO, longtime CEO of NCCN. I was also Vice President for Clinical and Coverage Policy at Aetna, so I've seen it both from the provider side and the payer side. Logistically, we're going to have 3 presentations. There'll be 480 seconds or 8 minutes each, followed by a Q&A and discussion. If you have questions, you can send them in via the format that's provided. So without further ado, we'd like to turn to Dr. Abraham for the first presentation of this webinar. Dr. Abraham?
Thank you very much. Ivo Abraham here, and I was asked to provide some kind of a general introduction to the issues that we'll be focusing on today in this webinar. And if I may have the next slide. Let's start by reflecting for a minute on this issue of cost and healthcare spending in the U.S. And these are general numbers. They come from the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which publishes health statistics every year for all of its member countries. And the data that you see here are for 2014, so still relatively recent. And we always hear this issue of, in the U.S. we're spending way too much on healthcare and way too much on pharmaceuticals. So let's look at the data for a second. And in the upper left panel, you see percentage of healthcare expenditures for a number of countries, and I just put up a few other ones there as a percent of GDP. So how much of our gross domestic product do we spend on healthcare? And there you see the U.S. in 2014 spent 16.6%, quite a bit higher than our, by lack of a better word, our peer countries. And if you go to the graph right below that, this translates into, on a per capita basis, $9,000 per year, or in 2014. So for every person in this country, all 310 million, we spent on average $9,024 dollars per year on healthcare, which is markedly higher, say roughly double those of other countries that I have listed there. Now, what about this notion of we're spending way too much on pharmaceuticals? And this is that in the third panel, the upper right-hand panel, percentage of our healthcare expenditures, so the total that we spend, and how much of that goes to pharmaceuticals. And there we are actually spending much lower than many of our peer countries. We're spending about the same as the UK, a little bit more than Sweden, but well below the other countries. So what does that tell us in a certain way is that, one, yes, we are spending proportionately less on pharmaceutical, and I emphasize proportionately. On the other hand, it still amounts to $1,100 per person per year, which is proportionately, as I said, less than other countries, but obviously in a nominal point of view, so actual layout, a pretty significant amount of money. Now, if I may have the next slide. In this debate about costs, what options do we have? And I listed here two options at kind of the extremes of the continuum. The first one is a pretty straightforward one, and that is to focus purely on cost. And that's intuitively, we could say that's a pretty easy solution because the payer decides it all, imposes price controls, enforces those price controls, and then the payer also decides about how much it wants to take in, how much it wants to pay out, and what it wants to do with the difference. This is what we see, for instance, in a system like in the UK, the National Health Service, where technically you have a single payer, and you could also say that you see it in general happening more in countries, in systems, healthcare systems with a single payer structure, which is obviously not the case of the US, which makes the management of cost in healthcare and in cancer care a bit more challenging for the US. I like the example of the CMS Oncology care model. And as an example of a model in the US where we try to partner in quality. And partnering in quality is to try to find the interface between costs and expenditures and the quality that can be achieved. What does that entail, or what does that require? It requires a certain amount of accountability, that we are held accountable. Provider organizations are held accountable for the performance and for the financial structure of that performance. But it can also then be tied into quality incentives, or quality incentives can be provided, as for instance is happening in the pilot models of the CMS Oncology care model, where incentives are paid out for such things as coordination of care, navigation, adherence to guidelines, which we know improves the quality of care, and also the notion of access to care. Next slide, please. I listed on this slide, and Dr. McBride will elaborate upon this in a few minutes, but I listed out of a very good article, I think, an overview of several value frameworks for oncology. And instead of going through these step by step, Dr. McBride will do that. I would like to lay the foundation by raising some issues here. And if you look at these different frameworks, ask yourself two questions. Is the focus on, in case of cancer, living longer, or is the focus on not only living longer, but possibly also living better? So this notion of quality of life and the extent to which we need to integrate a concept of quality of life in our value debate. There's the issue of efficacy and safety. This is an important one because when we want to do value-based evaluations, when we want to do economic analyses of cancer care, are we just focusing mainly on the efficacy component, or do we also need to take into account the safety component? And by safety, I mean very broadly toxicity, side effects, et cetera, et cetera. Another big element then you need to keep in mind is this notion of the QALYs. If you just take a quick look at this table, you don't see much QALY printed in there. In fact, ICER is the only one. The notion of quality, in my opinion, that's my opinion, is a helpful economic tool. However, from a clinical perspective or at the interface of clinics and economics, it is a much more difficult element or concept to use, because a QALY is a mathematical adjustment of our life year that is gained as a consequence of treatment. The QALY is also very difficult to explain, first to clinicians, but certainly to patients. How do you explain that your life will be about 0.73% of what a good life would be after you have your treatment? The other issue with QALYs is that it has been intrinsically linked to thresholds, and these thresholds go back to 1972. $50,000 was the estimated cost of life at that time. That was when Medicare was expanded to include patients with end-stage renal disease. Okay, we have we've become realistic and abandoned that 50,000, at least here in the US, but these thresholds still are being used, and we see a kind of threshold creep happening, and that is that we keep on bumping up the threshold to be able to say, yes, this is cost effective, when really the threshold, like the QALY, can be seen as a somewhat artificial type of concept. Two other elements, cost and price versus value. This is what we will be talking about much more in the coming half hour or so. And then finally, if you look, or when you look at economic analyses, you see this discrepancy either from the societal perspective or from the payer perspective, sometimes from other perspectives. Societal perspective is kind of like for the good of the society, but translates most often into for the good of society and the payments made by that society. The societal perspective, I think, works better in single-payer systems. It doesn't work as well in distributed payer systems like in the US. Next slide. Some of you may be familiar with the paper that Michael Porter from Harvard Business School had in the New England Journal of Medicine in about 6-7 years ago, where he proposes to use the metric of the cost per outcome achieved. So for every unit of outcome achieved, how much cost do we incur, and what would be reasonable to pay for? There's something intuitively very interesting and appealing about this model, but I think we need to look at some adaptations when we talk to cancer care. First of all, the Porter model has 3 tiers. The first tier is health status achieved or retained. Within each tier, you have 2 levels. So here, this is about outcomes related to health status, achieving it and retaining it. Survival is an important element, but then also the degree of health or recovery that can be achieved. Second tier that he focuses on is the process of recovery. First of all, the time to recovery, but then also adjusting it, and it gets a little bit technical here, for the disutility of care or treatment process. So basically adjusting it for the disadvantages, the adverse events, for instance, the toxicities, et cetera, that are associated with our care or treatment process. And then the third one, and I apologize that the title is correct, but I discovered this morning that the copy-paste got me here. But this third tier has to do with sustainability of health, and the 2 levels there are, and my apologies again, the absence of recurrence of disease or long-term complications, and then the other level is the long-term consequences of our therapy, and especially care-induced illnesses. Think, for instance, cardiomyopathy as a consequence of cancer treatment. The potential of the Porter model is then it's a very good concept. it's a very good idea, but we need to risk adjust over time. And risk adjust over time has to do with the type of cancer, stage of disease, how patients transition through stages of disease, how then the treatment options change, how the prognosis changes. We have to look at how our treatments come out of the trials in terms of efficacy, but how they play out in the real world, the treatment-related consequences and complications as they change over time, but then also some patient-related variables, patient acceptance, patient preferences, guidelines, and then clinician decision-making. Next slide, please. This brings us to ICER, and this is my last slide. ICER, Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, was set up as a not-for-profit in 2006. By their latest documentation, their funding distribution is indicated here, and we should be seeing some significant shifts in that funding distribution over the next couple of years. ICER has adopted, and I throw that out there as a point of attention, a threshold-driven value approach, distinguishing between long-term value, so basically what is the value for the money, and even though the cancer associations in the US and in Europe are not advocating a quality approach, ICER has taken the position that quality would be a key indicator to be considered. ICER also, in its threshold-driven value appraisal, focuses on short-term value, the affordability, which then refers to the budget impact that a new treatment may have. With this, I hope I've been able to provide an initial introduction to what Dr. McBride and Dr. Hinkel will talk about, and I will be available for questions later on. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So that was really good, to say, synopsis, obviously, of basically the situation from a spending perspective, right through, as I say, the introduction of the value metrics with the close here on ICER. So moving on, Dr. McBride, you'll take us, I think, further into this subject matter and into ICER as well. Dr. McBride.
Perfect. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Dr. Abraham. So again, the discussion, so my name is Ollie McBride. I am the clinical coordinator for the University of Arizona Cancer Center for Hematology and Oncology. And thank you again for the discussion. I look forward to our discussion today with our actually well-renowned panelists who are talking as well. So we'll actually kind of move on to our next slide, which will be value-based models in cancer. And this is something that Dr. Abraham has touched upon, Dr. Hinkel will also touch upon, and Bill will truly discuss as well as our moderator. But the value-based models in cancer, again, this is coming from the Oncologist 2016 article, has a lot of content in regards to what we consider value-based models in cancer care. In these cases, we have to evaluate what's happening in our current healthcare system. We know that costs and treatment innovations continue to drive the value discussion. This has been a very large discussion over the last few years. The discussion on value keeps on driving home points for the overall cost of value to patients. With those costs, again, we have seen a lot of these occur with the types of therapy. And just specifically talking about those pharmaceutical treatments, we have seen innovation lead to higher costs. But with anything in innovation, these innovative pieces are actually bringing about new therapies coming to market. The cost of these therapies are actually having higher price costs. Often in the oncology arena, newer therapies cost for a yearly cost of treatment over $100,000 per treatment in the majority of these new therapies coming into the marketplace. Other therapies may actually have marginalized discussion on overall costs as well. However, with the innovation, there also becomes imitation with these newer therapies. As such, the discussion with biosimilars coming into the marketplace over the next few years. But regardless of this, without innovation and also without newer therapies coming to market, with this change in healthcare, the continuing issue that is always addressed is access to options. Patients may often have or may not have the ability to actually acquire therapies for their continued use in the cancer setting. We have seen this numerous times in regards to the high costs, high copay shares, as well as numerous other endpoints that are often not seen, which can even include copays for oral chemotherapies as well. The continuing development for these discussions on value continues to derive through these 3 points. But again, the access to option is one that often hits home in these cases for value-based models. But as these costs continue to increase, we often just consider this as drug pricing, which I've listed here as one of our 4 listed. Now, there's overall model changes as well in these cases. So if the overall costs increase, we're looking at a global population cost. So this can include a larger number of patients coming into the actual incidence or being diagnosed based on new treatment methodologies. We can also have, in addition, larger or longer populations who have a chronic disease state, such as those patients being treated with CML therapies who have often lived longer, showing overall longer life expectancy. And again, since that is a longer outcome cost, that will also increase our overall healthcare costs as well. Medical resource utilization is another piece of that puzzle, utilizing more healthcare resources for patients. And sometimes this may occur in different positions in their life or in relapse refractory cases. With new technology coming on board, next generation sequencing, also newer therapies coming in light with biomarker-based studies, about 70%, these medical resources as a total will increase the actual utilization. With cancer care, we often see a large utilization of these healthcare resources and evaluation of these healthcare resources being documented and looked at for overall costs for the model of care. We had talked about this before, and that is drug pricing. Drug pricing is often the continued discussion throughout the marketplace. It is a constant topic seen in the media, seen in print, and also seen throughout the actual published literature as well. The costs of these therapies are coming into place in a much larger discussion, if not more salient discussion, for the overall cost of products. However, even though the drug costs may rise, there is a lack of discussion on this in terms of what's being prevented down the line. And as Dr. Abraham talked about, the oncology care model is an exact piece which we're looking for what can actually drive down costs, even though drug pricing may be higher. And another area which is often talked about and has garnered much discussion is end-of-life care. Actual end-of-life care is actually a large healthcare resource, again, taking a larger amount of the resources of the overall healthcare costs. In some cases, patients often being treated in the cancer setting, in these cases as well. So in these pieces, we have to address this going overall for the patient as well. So in this case, once we actually move on, for looking at the overall value framework, this is actually a piece where Dr. Abraham provided before. I will go through this characteristic like he had done before and trying to actually address some of these pieces about how these value metrics can actually be established and looked at as well. So here we actually have 5 different sources for consideration for value metrics. We have the ASCO source, the ESMO source, NCCN, ICER, and also Drug Abacus. Again, taking this article, looking at an overall viewpoint from the oncologist, each of these have different primary purposes. The ASCO model actually provides a shared decision-making tool with both patients and physicians. NCCN actually has provider and patient content as well as other stakeholders. ICER actually looks at the societal information as well as informing policymakers and payers. And also Drug Abacus following similar suits with informing policymakers and physicians. The ESMO source is actually unique. It's actually one coming out of Europe, again, looking at informing public policy as well as establishing and developing clinical guidelines as well to include that. So we do have a little bit of difference between these 5 pieces. Again, looking at the 4 in the U.S. that we've listed here, including ASCO, NCCN, ICER, and Abacus, we'll look at a few other targeted pieces of data and also what their data sources are, and also include a follow-up on the scoring, grading, costs, and updating this information as well. And I won't go through this verbatim, but just take a look at the ASCO piece and also compare it to the ICER piece. You can see that the treatment modalities assessed for ASCO include pharmaceuticals for both solid tumors and heme malignancies. The data source for this is actually looking at clinical trial data sources. It includes a net health benefit source, NHB, and also the cost is actually cost per month, looking at 2 different instances here. There's advanced disease or cost and course for the adjuvant setting as well. And the updating piece here is dynamic value changes as it impacts the actual agents of change for these treatment courses. When we take a look at ICER, we actually here have, looking at these patients, or these pieces, treatment modalities assessed. So that can include drug, devices, procedures, and also any delivery system innovations that have occurred that are being included in these models. The data source here is actually of note is the fact that we have with ICER clinical trial data, but we also have pharmacoeconomic pieces or the economic metric pieces that are often established in these discussions as well. Kind of a nice point in turn that I'm sure we'll be discussing here with our panelist group, as well as Dr. Hinkel when she actually touches upon the discussion of the pharmacoeconomic piece as well. And also scoring will be on an evidence rating matrix, and also care values, as discussed, will also be thought of this in regards to care values expressed as a quality and also health system value. So really judging learned term value as well. And in addition, there'll be also reports from individual areas as commissioned and also discussion on these updating processes as well. I really want to touch on these 2 points as a consideration for evaluation. As you can take a look again for your own edification here, NCCN also has their current clinical evaluation based on modalities assessed, and their data sources actually differ a little bit where they have clinical trials and also include, just as we know with the NCCN guidelines, expert consensus as well, and those are based on the evidence building scores as well as their affordability scale in addition to it. In addition, those are annually updated and changes are actually impacted based on the therapies as they change as well. So trying to keep up to date with that constant consideration for newer therapies coming on board, as well as changing the current practice or guidelines for therapy as new data is developed, which often occurs very often during the year as well. Next. When we take a look at the values in cancer care, this was actually a piece looking at the ASCO discussion, and I guess I want to actually really address this. So the Institute of Medicine has delineated 6 elements of value in cancer care. This is discussed throughout our discussions going into this, and it's also been one of the actual heated discussions going on in current policymaking. This includes safety, effectiveness, patient-centeredness, timeliness, efficiency, and also equity based on the value of the actual cancer patient. And when ASCO looked at these policy works or these value metrics, it only selected 3 of these for the framework that included clinical benefits such as effectiveness, toxicity or the toxicity profile for patients such as safety, and also cost, the efficiency of this model. So when looking at this, the analysts use a clinical health benefit score, and again I've noted this based on the previous table, and this would actually look at overall survival, progression-free survival, response rate. So looking at the outcomes of that clinical benefit score in these populations, as well as not only the benefit is being looked at, but ASCO provided the information for comparative toxicities of the 2 regimens. So that provided a net health benefit. And I think that latter discussion is very important as we look at values, and we'll be discussing this even further later on. And that is, how does the overall initial cost occur, but we often overlook the comparative toxicities downstream. And this continues to be a discussion overall for the overall cost that we're looking at. And what this will depict is, in some cases, a drug may have a higher initial cost, but overall toxicity profiles may be lower, and that net health benefit may provide a better option to the patient when deciding these therapies and also evaluating the value for these cancer patients. Next. But what does that have to do with institutions and also health systems as well as a payer-based model? So when we're taking and looking at these value metrics, we have to really think about how this will be implicated, how these will be developed. And so we often have to look at certain metrics based on what you're looking at for your own overall healthcare system. And here I tried to create a top-based evaluation, again, very overall general review of this, and that can include provider-based metrics. So if we have a provider, what are those metrics going to be? Will those be looking at ECOG scores for patients or the actual patient characteristics? Will that be documentation? So looking at progression, looking at the reasons why we're adding on certain tests. We'll also look at genetic tests, a constant issue in there as well, and I'll touch upon that a little bit later. So the provider-based metrics may be an important piece, if not a salient piece in that overall discussion, but that will then have to go to the provider to develop, working with their team and health system to really address and also implement this as well. And when looking at payer-based metrics, what will those be? Will those look at overall value, overall healthcare value? Will those look at overall costs? We constantly hear about the overall content discussion for the cost of a patient on treatment, and this goes back to that OCM piece which Dr. Abraham discussed, and looking at those overall costs as we see patients come into line with this data set may help the evaluation for payers as well. But metrics will have to be developed. Certain pieces of the puzzle will have to be developed, as well as understanding what those metrics will be when being outlined for the value for these patients. When looking at institutions, those institutions actually participating in certain value-based metrics, how will those be implemented? And again, the biggest issue here will be IT-based problems. So in these cases, looking at the IT-based value metrics, we have to address how those institutions will implement it. Will you include, for example, certain departments, such as those not just physicians, we have our nurse navigators, our nurses, our pharmacists, our overall healthcare workers, including social workers, even higher up to some extent, actually addressing these pieces for the implementation content for the institution to actually look at these value metrics for cancer patients. And also I kind of put here as a one-off is genetic-based evaluations for value metrics. So in the cases where we're looking at genetics, will those be looked at? Will those be the overall part of this? As we're looking at newer therapies coming to market, over 70% will have biomarkers, but also we're living in this newfound age of genetic-based technology such as next-generation sequencing, whole genome sequencing, which can actually look at new therapies which may have not been looked at before in the off-label setting. So will that also have implementation for value-based metrics as well in cases where we may not have a reported-based data set which can provide outcomes for patients, but may have a molecular-based data set which may change the overall metric value as well. Kind of something to think about here in addition to what the metrics will be defined as, but again, something that's actually occurring in about 10 to 20% of the patients across the board across the country. So when looking at these, you have to identify what those value metrics will be based on what you're participating in and also what you're working with in terms of a team-oriented workflow, and what may be superfluous or hard to identify. So if you can't measure it, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, as Peter Drucker would say. So how would you identify these pieces to make sure you can measure it at your own site or facility? And that will be a big question as those value-based metrics are determined and defined so you can implement them at your own site. Next. When we're taking a look at the actual implications of value metrics in this case, we can actually try to decide what that information is. If we're looking at shared outcomes and shared evaluations, we have to actually address the patient's decision. Something we've talked about as an overall workflow here throughout our value discussion. We're really now talking about the patient's decision on this evaluation. The patient's not a part of this decision. Will that affect their overall value-based discussion? That's a key important piece because one of the actual addressment points is to address how that patient's decision will factor into that value-based overall efficacy. In cases where we can see a patient may not be able to tolerate certain therapies, we may go to a softer therapy so they have, for example, a better outcome, a better quality in these patient cases, better outcomes of daily living as well. So we want to make sure we address those patient implications as well when looking at the value. And when we imply the value-based workflow, do we have to do this through certain treatments or options? And that's really where we have to evaluate the treatment options for patients. And that's when looking at the value-based care models, addressing what those outcomes are, which is essential. And that's what we've done for so many years, right? When we're evaluating treatment options, we're always looking at the outcomes. We're looking at either overall survival or progression-free survival. But that was the initial discussion. As we progress into the value metrics, we have to look at outcomes, symptom control, the overall quality, and also cost of treatment. All these combined provide a better example of the meaning of value. In addition, when we're looking at this, we often look at clinical outcomes. But one thing that doesn't occur is the upfront disbursement of that clinical or pharmacoeconomic piece with these clinical trials, which is so important. In fact, comparing these therapies potentially between indirect methods or direct methods becomes even more salient in that discussion because in these cases, newer therapies are often, therapies coming into light are often don't have a comparison model, which often needs to be addressed in the pharmacoeconomic model as well. Next. So when determining your metrics and also looking at value-based metrics, here's actually St. Franz Joseph Glacier from New Zealand. You look at this and it's actually looks rather small, but it's a very large glacier. Just looking at the bottom part of that hole there where the water is running out, that's approximately a 20-foot gap in the actual glacier. What we're looking at right now is a small discussion piece in the actual implementation, also process implementation for value-based metrics. But overall, we have a much larger discussion that needs to be addressed as well. And those can often be combined with a lot of the practice site initiatives the value-based model initiatives, and also implementation into your own healthcare system. Next. So when we take a look at this piece, we have to take just a sidestep and really look at what the overall metrics will be for cancer center development. So if your own cancer center is looking at this, what will be your outcome measures? How will you define this? Will a standardized format be used for those patients on therapy? Will overall survival be used? PFS survival? Will treatment changes occur as part of the outcome measurement as well? Even increased scans may be a discussion on that point. Structural-based measures will often have to be looked at. Again, that will be implementation practice settings. For those, will certain workflows to be developed, IT structures being worked in hand to really address these outcome and value-based measurements. Process measures, how do you grade these metrics? How do you implement these metrics for overall value? Efficiency measures will also need to be addressed in terms of these outcomes and definitions as well. Excuse me. In addition, cost of care measures. Again, it's an important point which often comes up is the overall cost of care. Will that include just the cost of care of a therapy, as we have talked about for so many years? But has a transition also occurred to discuss potentially other supportive care measures, maybe even increased ER visits, increased clinic visits after chemotherapy is implemented? These are the overall cost of care measures we're trying to find and also garner more information on. And lastly, proof in point, looking at patients' perception of care measures. So what's the patient's perception of care? What is the patient's overall decision on these value-based metrics? That is something that we're continuing to work on and address as an overall health system in terms of the country and also an institutional policy, but is one of the salient features in looking at the overall measures for patients and also how they decide and also work to evaluate the overall value cancer model. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. McBride. And again, thank you for the, taking the perspective into the institutional setting as we will all be involved in the various stakeholders across cancer care delivery. So our last speaker today is Jennifer Hinkel, and Jennifer, I think, will provide us more of a critique of the potential applications and influence, either positive or negative, of these various value metric frameworks, I think, again, with an emphasis on ICER. So, Jennifer.
Thanks very much, Bill. So I will take a little bit of what I would call a political economic view of ICER and the value frameworks. So to go to the next slide, my perspective on the context, and I think we've had a really good overview from some of the other speakers on how many of these different metrics break down. And really for the U.S. market, because the ESMO metric or framework is focused on Europe, we see four potential frameworks, with two of them really having potential impact to market access and decision-making autonomy. And so NCCN evidence blocks and ICER certainly are top of mind. ASCO value framework and the drug advocates for Memorial Sloan Kettering are ones that are being talked about, but as of yet, they don't really seem to have a clear path to implementation, at least not as clear of a path as NCCN, whose guidelines are already tied to coverage policy in the U.S., and ICER, which as an organization has been very clear that they are publishing tools that can be useful for payers and for PBMs. So to look at the next slide, I'll just give a brief overview of ICER and how it developed. A few of these points have been made, but I think when looking at ICER and considering a critique of the organization, it's important to consider some of the individuals involved in founding this organization, as well as their sources of funding, members of the board, and in the backgrounds that those individuals come from. And it does seem to be an organization with very close ties to the health insurance managed care industry, as well as ties to NICE in the UK. So Dr. Pearson, who's the founder of ICER, had held roles both in NICE and in AHIP, the Association of Health Insurance Plans, which is the trade group for the managed care industry in the US. ICER was spun out of an academic group at Harvard Medical School, and really its initial funding and a large part of its continued funding comes from the Blue Shield of California Foundation. So although that is foundation funding, and they've gotten kind of more funding from the foundation side in terms of a single a one-time grant that was pretty significant. A few years ago, that was the $5.3 million grant from the Arnold Foundation in 2015. We really do see that they continue to have strong backing from the managed care industry, and that the funding that they say comes from life sciences companies and pharma biotech companies really seems to be more of tickets or booth or sponsorship space at some conferences they've had in the past. So it's really just in the past year or two that ICER has adopted this quite aggressive publishing schedule of reports seeming to target agents and disease areas that are very highly prominent in public discussion and policy and in the media. So they've looked at hepatitis C drugs, they've looked at a number of different cancers and cancer drugs, including the anti-PD-1s in the non-small cell lung space. And many analysts in this area think that this is quite a calculated move on ICER's part to raise their profile, to get a lot of media attention, and to really make themselves an important player in the policy sphere. So going on to the next slide, I'll look at some specific critiques that have bubbled up since ICER's put out its report on non-small cell lung cancer. So really there has been a question among the clinical community of whether ICER is equipped to make accurate assessments in non-small cell lung cancer and a number of the other clinical areas it's addressed. And just to go through this chart and some of the flaws or issues that the clinical community has identified, as well as the health economics community. ICER does not include disease-specific clinical experts on its advisory panels. So it may reach out kind of in an ad hoc fashion to a few different experts on a disease-specific basis, but the voting panels and the internal staff are meant to be able to look at every single disease state. So whether that would be products or diseases that are more primary care or virology or cancer, they're really meant to cover the whole landscape. So particularly in oncology, I think this raises some concerns among clinical professionals who have spent their careers in very specialty or even subspecialty areas. The question of whether a generalist can appropriately assess the value of an oncology product really does raise some red flags for people. Secondly, looking at how ICER conducts its processes from literature review through to the health economic review, I think there are questions about what processes ICER has in place to prevent or limit bias. And this has really come out of looking at some of their recommendations and some of the mistakes that ICER has made in the past. So, for example, vast overestimation of budget impact for some products and what that would mean. In some cases, I think they've overestimated budget impact by more than 90%. And then on the other side, they say, oh, a drug price should be reduced by 70 or 80% to meet those targets. So this is really seen, I think, by many as a bit biased and is a bit pushing a particular agenda that says that drug prices are too high. Thirdly, ICER really does evaluate products very close to their time of approval or even pre-approval. I think that this is a bit questionable as a process, looking at things very early in the life cycle before the data is really out. While you have data enough to get an FDA approval, really the understanding of the value of that product over its life cycle would not be understood at that point. Fourthly, the staff bandwidth at ICER is really not very big. It's still a pretty small organization, between about 20 and 30 people. And so looking at all the different disease areas they're looking at hepatitis C, and then switching over to looking at non-small cell lung cancer, looking at multiple myeloma, again, without a lot of disease-specific expertise. There are questions about whether they have the bandwidth to really do the work that they've proposed that they're going to do, as well as updating all of these reports. So any of these disease areas are going to have new products coming out in the next probably 1 to 3 years. ICER has not really put forth any proposal about how it's going to keep on top of these things, especially if these reports are being used as any kind of basis for coverage policy, market access, et cetera. And then lastly, a critique that's been pretty widely stated, ICER has not published its processes or its standards or its results in a peer-reviewed journal. So, this is a little bit contrary to a lot of health economic analyses that are put out there. There are questions about whether ICER's processes would be able to meet for peer review. ICER's response to this is, well, we have a big panel and this voting panel kind of serves as peer review. And I don't know if that argument really holds up that well among the clinical experts as well as health economic experts. So on the next slide, here's just an example of one of the kind of major and recent public critiques that's taken place with ICER, where you have these 5 leading oncologists in lung cancer who took a look at that non-small cell lung cancer report and voiced a lot of concerns about ICER's ability to interpret the clinical evidence to reach appropriate conclusions on drug value and to do so in an unbiased and scientific fashion. So if you want to read that full op-ed, it's available online in the Oncology Business Review. It was published in October, just before ICER's public meeting on non-small cell lung cancer. So on to the next slide. Some of the themes that came out of that, and I think these have been widely agreed with by other experts and authors who critique ICER, others writing in the public sphere, some things that they think should be basically the table stakes for any organization proposing to create these value frameworks, to really include disease experts as evaluators and authors, to make sure that the endpoints, conclusions, definitions of value are patient-centered. I think that this has been a big question, and it ties back to what was said earlier in this webinar regarding the QALY. Thirdly, to make sure that there are rigorous methodologies, that they reflect the best practice of evidence-based medicine. Continuous review and revision, so making sure that these aren't just snapshots in time of particular diseases or drugs very early on in the life cycle. And then lastly, make sure that everything that would be published regarding a value framework would be peer-reviewed and have a scientific standard of authorship. I mean, I think we see this when we look at what ASCO has done and what NCCN has done. So the thought is to hold ICER to the same standard. So I'll conclude with that, and then we can go into the questions. So I'll hand it back to Bill.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer. So let me start with you, and then we'll go to Dr. McBride and Dr. Abraham with a question that's come in. And this is very timely, considering I'm sitting in Pennsylvania. Just saw an email bulletin flash across the screen that the Pennsylvania Electoral College has cast their votes. I'll leave you all to go see what the votes were. But anyway, but given that we're going to have a new, incoming administration, Jennifer, what does this mean, do you think, for the effort, movement, trend, or whatever you want to call it, for the development, and more importantly, again, the application of these oncology value frameworks? Is this going to change the playing field? Do these value frameworks fly below what people at the new people at CMS, at HHS are going to focus on?
Yeah, so I would say this is a really timely question, and I think contrary to what we would be acting on and planning for if we had an incoming Clinton administration where we knew that ICER would be very high on the agenda in a positive way from their perspective, I think with the incoming Trump administration, this is very much not a priority in the same way that it would have been otherwise. So, some of the things I'm hearing out of the transition team is high priorities. Certainly looking at opiate prescription and addiction is a very high priority. Secondly, looking at 340B. So I think those are things that, are not aligned with what ICER is doing. And so I think in a way, this organization is not going to have the same backing from HHS and CMS that it potentially would have had in a different scenario. So that, it leaves a little bit of a question. I mean, one of the questions I have is where ICER's funding will come from. If they were counting on some government funding, I don't think that that's going to happen. So we'll see what the organization proposes as their next steps.
All right, interesting perspective. Dr. McBride, your perspective?
No, I think that this is a big question. I had to give a sigh before I answered it, because anytime there's a transition between powers and also governmental agencies and also a different philosophy, I think we will probably have to almost run kind of a wait and see, and not a hurry, wait type of atmosphere discussion. So I think one of the key pieces, as already provided to us, is going to be, what will be the major goals? Will it be an overall cut in healthcare costs, just in terms of drug prices? Will it be further implementation for some of these current or continued policies? I'm not sure. I think we'll have to wait and see, unfortunately. I think the current-based discussions for pharmaconomics will continue regardless, but I think that the value-based discussions are going to be a very important discussion that will need to take place. With regards to how it's going to affect institutions, I think that's going to be one of the biggest questions, because a lot of institutions are implementing or about to implement a lot of policies and also addressing a lot of work with the payers to see this value-based care model. Looking at overall cost models and actual efficacy for these models may change based on the new administration, and I think that's going to be a little bit of a concern, but also may provide maybe a better light in terms of what they'll be looking for in the future as well. So I don't have a great answer for you, Bill. I think it's more of a watch and wait discussion, but it brings about a lot of questions.
A judicious answer. All right, Dr. Abraham?
Well, I'm probably of the three panelists the one who is not a U.S. citizen, so I didn't get to vote. So my observations are more from the sidelines, so to speak. I think we have to wait and see. There's two positions, then we're still waiting to hear who will fill them, and that's the head of the FDA and the head of CMS, as far as I know it, and that is checking the news last night, last time. I think that will give us some indication. On the other hand, as a more editorial comment, it is difficult to really see a line in all of the appointments that are being made, a line that is very clear in terms of what the policies may be with regard to healthcare financing, et cetera. And I was in Europe last week, and those were the same debates going on there as to what can we expect from the U.S. in this regard. Not that that would directly impact European policy, but everybody's curious about that. I would not be surprised if there is a general trend of kind of across the board cost cutting, so basically setting margins, because I think that the president-elect has indicated that.
Hello? I think we just lost Dr. Abraham. Is that correct? Dr. Abraham? All right. So anyway, so it's 5 minutes before the hour. We have a whole list of questions that have come in. I maybe we'll do this again and continue on just with the discussion. But for right now, I think I need to turn it back to Stephanie at ICLIO headquarters. Stephanie?
Thank you, Bill. And actually, I do have two questions that came in. One is posed for Jennifer. How do cancer institutions currently use oncology value frameworks?
Thanks, that's a great question. So I think that we've seen all of these as a little bit more of a reference tool or like a point of information. I don't know any stories of an institution actually implementing them in any fashion, whether it's through an institution pathway, formulary, et cetera. So I would be interested to hear if you have any examples out there in the community of that really it seems to be more of an informational reference exercise right now.
Thank you. And then the last question, maybe Ali can reference or answer. How much difference can we expect to see as biosimilars begin to be approved and made available in cancer care?
That's a great question. I think that's something that would have been great also with Ivo and myself on board with this. Looking at value in healthcare costs with biosimilars is a very big discussion because we have seen the European model work very well in decreasing overall healthcare costs, but also providing the same outcomes. So if we can decrease costs and actually increase or maintain outcomes, that would overall increase our values or our value-based care setting. So in the overall expected decrease, we've seen the 15-20%, we've seen the 10 to 30%. The initial first growth factor, which is a biosimilar, actually the first biosimilar in the U.S., Filgrastim and Sandoz, that actually the 15% initial markup. But as noted in Europe, what we'll see is probably a price war develop and also kind of erode the overall cost. And we'll probably see those prices drop over the next few years, especially with the advent of new competition coming to market, garnering those areas for niche-based treatments or in some cases overall-based treatments like we'll probably see with the ESAs coming into the market, hopefully with the biosimilar area rather soon. So I do think we'll see a drop in overall costs as price competition develops among larger competition with the biosimilar companies in this area. We'll probably see a larger erosion in the overall cost values, but that will decrease costs in the overall healthcare setting, especially in oncology And as we see new therapeutic biosimilar markets come to light, that will also provide a new means or a new option for treatment in this setting as well. So 15% is what we expect, but we'll probably see a little bit larger number increase as time goes on with the biosimilars coming to market in the U.S. over the next few years.
Great. Well, thank you, Bill, for moderating, and the panelists for providing your insights on this important topic. We also would like to thank the audience for participating. The webinar and slides will be available on our website, accc-iclio.org, shortly, and all the registrants will receive an email with a link. In the new year, ICLIO will be launching a new role-specific immunotherapy module for the multidisciplinary team for ICLIO. Stay tuned for more details coming your way in the near future. That concludes our webinar today. Happy holidays, and thank you, and enjoy the rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Bill.